And we're talking about the possibility that he could be removed from court if he continues. So we got to talk about what that impact could be. Let's ask former federal prosecutor and partner at Jones Walker, David Weinstein. Thank you so much for being here. Man, this was a big week, David. I wanted to get your take first on what you thought about this stern warning from the judge and the very idea that Sean Combs has been looking at jurors when he hears something that he likes and he nods along and then he tries to make eye contact with them. What do you think about that?
Well, Laura, you were there in the courtroom. You see what's going on. There's a distinct difference between a defendant or any litigant who simply is nodding along with testimony they hear that's favorable or shaking their head when they disagree with something that somebody said. But that's distinct and different from a participant who looks directly at a juror or the jury and stares them down and does the same thing. And that's what the judge is trying to prevent from happening here. We've seen it happen in other criminal trials where a judge has simply just had enough from a defendant who is trying to influence the jury indirectly and not testifying. If he wants to get on the stand and testify and say he disagrees with what was said, that's his right and he's entitled to do that. But to stare a jury down and to try and intimidate them that way, that comes in within the control of the judge and how the judge controls their courtroom.
Right. And let's not forget that the very reason that Sean Combs is still locked up at the MDC is because he was accused of making calls and possibly trying to, get a hold of witnesses and talk to them before the trial. And they said, that's not going to happen. You're going to stay, bail is denied. So there's a history there. So if Combs is ejected from the courtroom, sounds like he's going to be on his best behavior. Mark Agnifilo said, we got the message. He's not going to do it anymore. But what could it have on his defense moving forward? Because, we still have about 4 more weeks to go on this.
Well, they have to control their client. They have to get him to understand that he's had his chances. And also remember, in addition to being kept in jail because he's intimidating witnesses, they allege that that's part of the ongoing racketeering conspiracy. So if I'm his lawyer, I'm telling my client, you're showing the jury that you're doing exactly what the government claims you're doing, and you're doing it right in front of them. So you want to disagree? Look at us, talk to us, write a note. Don't stare down the jury. And so they're going to have to control their client, but they're going to continue to be vigorous in their cross-examination of the witnesses.
I also wanted to ask you about some paperwork that we just got online yesterday. It was made publicly available that the defense has asked for a mistrial. This is, this happens all the time. But they asked for a mistrial because one of the witnesses, a woman who was on the stand, talked about being dangled over a balcony in 2016. She had a brutal cross-examination where she couldn't quite, the dates didn't quite match up. And the defense is saying that prosecutors knew that she wasn't going to have correct testimony. They're asking for a mistrial. Just your thoughts on that. How frequent is it that a mistrial can be declared in a federal case like this?
It's infrequent that the judge will actually declare a mistrial. The conduct that was undertaken either by a witness or the prosecution has to be way over the line. Now, on this one, they're claiming that the prosecution knew this witness was going to give testimony that they were going to cross-examine her on and show not to be true. But there's a distinct difference between a witness whose memory is bad and defense attorneys who do a fantastic job in digging up dirt to cross-examine that witness, show that that witness is not telling the truth. The burden here is to prove the prosecution knew she was going to be untruthful. Well, haven't seen anything yet about that.
Yeah, and she may have just simply had the dates wrong and might have had the wrong, they showed a timestamp of some of the pictures that were wrong. So we'll see what happens with that, and I'm sure they're going to get to that tomorrow morning. We're also hearing testimonies from a lot of witnesses here, David, saying that Sean Combs was violent and abusive. And I mean, these stories, I've been in the court, and it is just awful what we're hearing, and it's one after the other. But that is not what he's on trial for. Is the prosecution doing enough to prove the sex trafficking and racketeering claims at this point, or are they still just trying to lay the groundwork?
They're doing both, Laura. Remember, the sex trafficking claims are separate, substantive counts. They have to prove that he did sex traffic in these particular victims they've named. The rest of the conduct, it's part of what's called the overt acts, the underlying racketeering conspiracy, and part of that is his intimidation of witnesses, the way he controls the organization. And that's what that violence is going towards. The defense has sought to characterize that as uncharged acts. There are no battery counts here. This is not a state indictment for assault and battery, but the prosecution is weaving all of this into the story they're telling the jury to prove that racketeering conspiracy, to prove the overt acts that they've alleged in the racketeering conspiracy. So you're going to hear a lot more of that